are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, military doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, excuse me, all by way of one of them was that the Ottoman Empire, which is basically based in what is now Turkey, was one of the central powers. So unlike World War II, where we had the Allies and the Axis, in World War I, we had the Allies, which were, in the beginning of the war, essentially France, Great Britain, and Italy. And you had the central powers, which was Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And so the Egyptian Expeditionary Force began to counter the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire's influence in the Middle East as well, in order to weaken the Ottoman Empire and make them a less effective partner of the Central Powers. And, you know, spoiler alert, right? The Ottoman Empire essentially fell after World War I. So that became a second goal of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. And another one was just generally expanding British influence in the Middle East, in particular, creating or setting up the Sinai Peninsula as a buffer zone to protect the Suez Canal. So at this time, Egypt was essentially a British colony. So on the west side of the Suez Canal, Great Britain controlled Egypt. And by gaining control of the Sinai Peninsula, now Great Britain controlled both sides of the Suez Canal and could protect this important waterway. But as well, they wanted to expand their influence in sort of greater Palestine, capturing key cities, for example, Jerusalem, gaining control of Syria, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, and by taking away this part of the empire, eventually helped lead to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So one of the ways that Great Britain it increased their influence in the Middle East was by supporting Arab revolts. So the Ottomans, which were essentially the Turks, not the same group of people as the Arabs. The Ottomans, in many ways, subjugated the Arabs, and many Arab countries wanted to be independent of the Ottoman Empire. And by the way, this is the story of Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, right? He was a British army officer who basically embedded himself with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and worked with this Arab revolt to overturn Ottoman control, and essentially to destabilize their rule, right? And so Lawrence was essentially, and I say essentially because it's a long and complicated story, but he was essentially acting as an adjunct of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. Now, of course, there's a whole story about that, and that's not my subject for today, although that would be an interesting subject to review. So I'll have to make a mental note of that. And then again, weakening the Ottoman Empire so that it was a less effective partner within the Central Powers. All of that became then the goal of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. So, General Sir Archibald Murray was the commander-in-chief, basically, of the EEF, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. And in March, on March 26th, 27th of 1917, he fought the first Battle of Gaza, Gaza being sort of in the northeastern corner of the Sinai Peninsula. And on April 17th through 19th of 1917, he fought the second Battle of Gaza. And as you might imagine, since there was a second one, he lost the first, but he also lost the second. So in both battles, he failed to capture Gaza. It remained in Ottoman hands. And so after the second failure, the British government decided he had to be replaced, and that's when Allenby took over. So, in looking at what Archibald Murray did wrong, there were several things, and these led essentially directly to his defeats in the first and second battles for Gaza. The first was poor coordination and timing. So the British forces faced a lot of delays in the first Battle of Gaza in sort of launching their attack and making it effective. And as a result, the Ottoman defenders had a lot of time to figure out how to defend against the EEF. And so that all in war, obviously surprise is always a desirable element. So if you do not coordinate your attack well, if you do not time it properly, you're really setting yourself up for defeat, right? This was General Patton's whole philosophy of always keeping his army moving, always planning 2, 3, 4 steps ahead so that he didn't need to stop, regroup, always keep the enemy on their heels, right? And that took an enormous amount of coordination. And I think it's reasonable to say that a lot of the success that General Patton had in World War II with the Third Army had to do with how superbly his staff coordinated all of the planning and events that then were executed by Patton and his subordinate commanders. Okay, now lest you mistake, Patton demanded that level of coordination. So as a leader, he knew what it took, but also he made sure A, his people knew his expectations, and B, that if they didn't meet those expectations, that basically they were replaced, right? And he felt that his soldiers deserved that kind of excellent coordination from his staff. So that was one problem that Murray faced in the First Battle of Gaza. Another was he overestimated the Ottoman strength. So Murray and his staff and his subordinate commanders, they all thought that the Ottomans were receiving reinforcements. They were always concerned they were going to be outflanked, and so in the end, after 2 days of battle, fearing that the Ottomans were going to move from the defense to the offense, British forces withdrew, even though they were pretty close to victory. And if Murray had better understood the situation, he might have been victorious in the first Battle of Gaza. So he really didn't have the courage of his convictions. He didn't have confidence in his staff, in his own judgment, and on some level, and so he withdrew, and as a result lost that battle. Next, he had inadequate logistical support. So there were long supply lines across the Sinai Desert coming from basically Egypt. The Sinai is a pretty harsh environment in which to bring supplies, bring troop reinforcements, etc. And he just didn't have his logistics, his resupply well enough organized, I think, to give him the confidence that these things would be there, when they were needed. And this now, one could argue, well, World War I was at the beginning of very highly mechanistic warfare, and so the idea of logistics being so important may not have been well understood. I reject that argument. The Civil War in the United States, the Boer War in South Africa, these were pretty heavily mechanized wars, especially for their time. They required a tremendous amount of logistics support. And indeed, one of the reasons why the North won the Civil War is they just had better logistics. They had more railroads, they had more industrial capacity, etc. All of that made them a much more formidable force than the Confederate Army. And look, it's incumbent upon a commander, especially a commander-in-chief of a force the size of the EEF, to understand the changes that are happening in warfare, and to be able to apply those changes, even if he has to get somewhat creative to do so, I should say, and as well to be able to, on some level, anticipate what changes need to be made, so that the commander is not fighting the last battle, but is indeed fighting the battle that's in front of him, as we talked about on an earlier episode of the show. finally, in addition to poor coordination and timing, overestimating Ottoman strength, and inadequate logistical support, um, 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 Murray made a number of tactical mistakes, and part of this was because the British cavalry and the infantry did not coordinate well. But in any event, these tactical missteps really allowed the Ottomans to be able to regroup and maintain their resistance, and as a result, the EEF lost the First Battle of Gaza. So one would have thought, right, that Murray would have learned some good lessons from that defeat. But a month later, he was back for what became known as the Second Battle of Gaza, and while he didn't repeat every single mistake, he repeated some and made some others. So first of all, by the time the Second Battle of Gaza began in on April 17th, I believe it was. So the Ottomans had more time. First of all, they knew what was up. They knew that the EEF was not going to permanently withdraw, and so they spent that month or so strengthening their defenses. So they fortified their positions with trenches and barbed wire, machine guns, really creating a battlefield very much like what was going on in Europe at the time. So, it was no longer the sort of, dashing battles that you see in Lawrence of Arabia, horse-mounted, cavalry attacks and that sort of thing. And because the Ottoman defenses changed, the British tactics should have changed, but instead, the British continued with frontal assaults that, just like they became in Europe, very, very costly. I mean, frontal assaults on trenches blocked by barbed wire and with and machine gun nests. The Allied forces in Europe realized pretty quickly that frontal assaults were just not going to be the path to victory. So that was one problem. The second problem was Murray relied too much on artillery. Now, in Europe, the advent of combined arms, where an artillery barrage would be laid down ahead of advancing troops, that certainly made sense and was a tactic that eventually led to victory. But what would happen with the EEF is they basically tried to artillery bomb the Ottomans into submission, and this just wasn't going to work. So this was the reason for having trenches, right? Is to protect oneself from artillery attacks. And so while artillery bombardments could shake up the enemy, it could distract the enemy, it was not going to defeat the enemy, not by itself. Okay, this is the same mistake that was made in World War II with so-called strategic bombing that was supposed to demoralize the civilian population of the enemy and bring the war to a quick close. It just did not work. The evidence shows today that bombing civilians just basically hardens the civilians to suffering, but it doesn't encourage them to push for their governments to surrender. So, the Ottomans were able to survive the artillery attacks, and so they basically were not an effective tool to try and defeat them. Next was Murray pursued a static, predictable strategy. So rather than adapting his strategy and his tactics to the situation that was in front of him, he just kept pounding away on these frontal attacks and these artillery attacks. And of course, the Ottomans knew, hey, this is what he's going to do. So, as long as he's going to just throw men at us, we'll machine gun them down and we'll be able to defend ourselves. And indeed, that's essentially what happened. And so Murray really failed to learn from his mistakes. He also, another one of the problems that emerged in the Second Battle of Gaza was that the British intelligence was completely inadequate in terms of understanding the Ottoman forces, the size, their skill, where they were moving, how they were being reinforced. It just did not support the kind of activities and the kind of planning, strategy, and tactics that Murray needed to do. And then finally, as you might be able to guess, these continued frontal assaults that repeatedly led to defeats really demoralized the EEF troops, and the huge number of casualties, deaths, and woundings just demoralized the troops to the point where they really they just didn't have the resolve that's necessary for fighting fighting this kind of battle, for fighting any kind of battle. And so Murray's inability to learn and adjust and therefore fail a second time at Gaza led British leadership to essentially fire him and replace him with General Sir Edmund Allenby. So Allenby came in and with a fresh approach. And in the third battle for Gaza, or third battle of Gaza, Allenby was successful. So it's a difficult thing to come in behind a commander. Even the least successful commander oftentimes can be very, popular with the rank and file. And even if he's not particularly popular, they're going to feel a certain loyalty to that commander. And so to come in and replace someone that these soldiers had been through such horrible fighting with, while on the one hand they may have been relieved that they weren't going to have to face Murray's throwing them at machine guns anymore. First of all, they have no idea whether Allenby is going to be a better commander and make the changes that are necessary. And so too, so oftentimes it's better the devil kind of thing. And so it's a difficult situation for any leader to replace another leader, but coming in and to face a failed leader, it's a dicey situation. So what did Allenby do then that allowed him to be successful? So first of all, he took a number of steps to reorganize and boost morale. He reorganized the BEF the whole way that logistics were done, the whole way that the troops were supplied, the whole way that units were organized for battle. And he organized communications so that there would be closer and better coordination. All of this changing around, it broke old patterns. And that created some hope among the rank and file troops that, okay, well, this isn't going to be more of the same. So maybe there is hope here that we're not just going to get slaughtered mounting frontal attacks the way we had in the last two battles of Gaza. So the reorganization, it was, first of all, a needed reorganization, but also it was an attempt, and a successful attempt, to boost morale, which was very low as a result of the two prior defeats. So that was number one. The second one was Allenby used deception and diversion in his attacks against the Ottoman forces. So rather than these just, frontal attacks, what he did was he pretended like he was going to make frontal attacks, while instead he made flanking attacks, and he would make it look like he was going to have a frontal attack over here while he actually attacked a different objective. And so the deception and the diversion confused the Ottomans, the Ottoman forces, kept them off balance, and they no longer had the predictability that had allowed them to effectively defend their positions. So as a result, on October 31st, 1917, the Third Battle of Gaza began with the campaign against Beersheba, where Allenby not only captured Beersheba, but he also secured water supplies, and he outflanked Gaza, which, now he could come in from the flank, is the side, of course. He could come in from the side, which the Ottoman forces weren't prepared to defend against. And then on November 7th, he launched coordinated artillery and infantry assaults, like the armies had been doing on continental Europe for some time at this point. And in doing so, he rendered the Ottoman positions just untenable, and they had to retreat. Right. So by just recognizing what was necessary strategically and tactically to be successful, reorganizing his forces to follow this new strategy and tactics from very late October through November, Allenby was able to turn things around in the Battle of Gaza and end up being successful. So as a result of Allenby's success, the Ottomans suffered a significant, a really major blow in their control of the region, and he transformed the Middle Eastern theater of war in such a way as to make a real contribution to the Allies' victory in World War I. So, what do we take for this for our own businesses? Well, first of all, and this may be the hardest lesson, right? We may not be the right leader for our business any longer. And that's a hard thing to come to terms with. So I was talking with a friend of mine last night who's working for a startup company, and both the founders are still at the company. They both essentially run the company. And this is not the first conversation we've had about this, but it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer that the CEO and founder of the company, it's time for him to step down. What needs to be done in order for this company to be successful is a different skill set than what he has. The major ability that he has is still something important for the company, but that major skill that he has is not what the CEO of the company needs now in order to be successful. And so while in the case of Murray and Allenby, Murray didn't voluntarily step down, he was replaced. Unless we have a board of directors that can fire us, which most of us don't. So we need to be self-aware enough to understand when our time as an effective leader is gone, and where a different type of leadership, or a leader with different abilities than what we have as strengths, is required to take our company to the next level. So that's probably the most difficult decision we would ever make. Now, more on point to the Murray Allenby situation is, we may have leaders within our company that, for whatever reason, have not kept up with what needs to be done in order to continue to lead in their part of the company. And in that case, they need to be replaced. Okay. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're setting up their replacement for success. So their replacement needs to have the freedom of action to really go in and reorganize, re-strategize, plan new tactics for how to make his part of the company, of the business, of the professional practice successful. Now, that may run counter to what we, as the top leader, thinks needs to be done. So if we were the British defense minister, okay, we chose Allenby to take over from Murray. Okay, Allenby needed to know that he had the confidence of the defense minister, that if he went in and completely reorganized the situation, he'd be allowed to do that and not micromanaged. Now, that was easier in 1917, where the immediacy of communication isn't what it is today. And it's potentially easier in a combat theater than it is in a company where we're all there, we see each other all the time, or we may all work in the same building, or at least we're in a constant series of meetings. But the reality is, we need to give a new leader the freedom and opportunity to plan a new path, because in many cases, probably in most cases, that's what it's going to take to be successful when one is succeeding a failed leader. So people need to be shown. Telling people doesn't help. I mean, well, I shouldn't say it doesn't help. It's not going to be the decisive factor, them being told. People need to see that real change is taking place. Okay. And so the new leader coming in has to be seen as someone, A, who will make change, B, who is supported in making change by higher echelon, and 3, that the changes are going to be beneficial toward, in the case of a business, a particular division, we'll say for now, division meeting its objectives. To make that clean break, okay? If a leader has failed, for someone to come in and continue with the failed policies of the previous leader, that new leader is unlikely to succeed. Okay. And it has to do with how people look at things. But if people have been through a failure, they're likely to feel demoralized, right? And so the first step toward victory is re-energizing, raising the morale of I hate this term, but rank and file people, the people in the company who are charged with executing the tactics that will succeed in gaining an objective. And so they have to have a feeling that there's real change afoot and that change is supported. Okay. And then the third thing about being a successful leader in the wake of a failed leader is showing that whatever tactics you're going to pursue will actually be effective. Okay. So it's one thing to try or to use different tactics. Okay. But do the people you're leading sense or feel or think that these new tactics actually might work? Okay, this is the lesson of Allenby using diversion and deception. Okay, so it's one thing for him to use coordinated artillery and infantry attacks. So by October 1917, it was pretty well established that these tactics were the, if any kind of combat tactic, if you will, was going to work, that's what worked in trench warfare, so-called combined arms in that sense. Okay, however, combined arms alone was not going, I don't think would have convinced the rank and file troops that there was a big enough change in tactics that they were going to be successful. So it was the recognition of the combined arms plus a different way of applying the combined arms that gave the troops a sense that we can in fact win the Battle of Gaza. And that's the same thing in our businesses. So changing kind of part of the tactics, but not all of the tactics, may not get us all the way there, especially when we're replacing a failed leader. So anything that remains of how the failed leader handled things is likely to cast some doubt on the current leader's ability to succeed in achieving the objective. And so in some cases, there may need to be change purely for change's sake. Okay. Now, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? To use an old saying. However, if it may be that we can make a change where the new tactic is certainly not going to be any worse than the previous tactic, and as long as it's not going to be worse, it's probably worth giving serious consideration to changing it, because the change alone can give our team a fresh view as to whether they can be successful or not. Right? So the lessons of Murray and Allenby at Gaza are that when you are faced with replacing or succeeding a failed leader, okay, it really requires a holistic examination of why did the previous leader fail, what changes need to be made, how do I present those changes to my team so that they will believe and gain the morale, believe that the changes will be effective and be reinvigorated, improve their morale, so that the new tactics, the new strategy can be employed to its best effect. Okay, and that's true on the battlefield. It was true on the battlefield in the Middle East in World War I, and it's true in our businesses and professions today, here in 2024 and beyond. So that's the lesson of the battles of Gaza in the Middle East during World War I, as they apply to succeeding a failed leader. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially, again, I've got some live viewers. Always so great to know that we're joining together live to talk about these things. Just a couple of quick mentions. Over here on my screen, I have a chat box, and it combines questions that you post from any social media that you may be watching this on. And so if you have a question or comment during a show, by all means, drop it into the chat. I'll be more than happy to respond to it. And while we're speaking of social media, so if you are not currently a subscriber to my YouTube channel, really would appreciate you doing so, or at least giving it consideration. And now, by the way, my shows are available on all three of the top video podcast platforms: YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Okay, so I'm not live on Spotify and Apple Podcast. I don't think one can do that, but usually shortly after a live broadcast ends, the show will be uploaded to Spotify, and from there it goes to Apple Podcast, and you can watch it there or listen to it there. If you want to listen to an episode again or watch an episode again, or if you want to share it with family, friends, always a nice thing to do, and very, very much appreciated. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Tomorrow on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Normally is my show, People Making Money, but in honor of Thanksgiving Day, I'll be doing a special edition of the Way to Wow shows for Thanksgiving Day, talking about, as I do for special editions, the history of Thanksgiving Day, and also reading George Washington's 1789 proclamation of Thanksgiving, to honor the holiday. So I hope you'll join me tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. My guest is Kaya Johnson. I was just talking with Kaya yesterday. We were catching up. It's going to be a great show. So Kaya is, like me, a professional fiduciary. He has a particularly interesting practice because he started out as a family office and then became a professional fiduciary. And so what he's seeing is sort of generational changes in his practice. And so that's Kaya and I are going to be talking about that. I think you'll find that very, very interesting. And so I encourage you to join us. And then a week from today, Tuesday at 10 a.m. will be the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. And just a quick reminder, next week, also on Thursday at 5 p.m. is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. It's at 5 p.m. on Thursdays Pacific time. And that's an opportunity for us to talk about all the things that are not business and professions related. So look forward to sitting down with you, having a cocktail, and talking about books and movies and relationships and ideas and all those things that really enrich our lives. So one last time, thanks so much for joining me today. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell.